Does she have a celebratory dance?
Without further ado, hello and welcome to the Hackaday Podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Kristina Panos.
This is episode 265, Behind the Epic SSH Hack, 1980s Cyber Butler, and the story of Season 7. This week in the news, I wanted to talk about two pieces really briefly. First, a giga-sunset for Gigaset IoT devices. Gigaset, I think it's actually a German company, went bankrupt, got bought out, and the company that bought it did not want to support their home automation IoT line. And the bad news is that its IoT devices rely on the Gigaset cloud servers, and they all got shut down March 29th, and they're done. So none of these IoT devices work anymore. They're all bricks until somebody gets out there and hacks them. My bet would be that a bunch of motivated hackers now own these devices and will probably try to stand up something like their cloud services on their own. So we'll see. Look out for that in the near future. And if you happen to have some of these, get in touch with people, form up a community, and try to get them working again, because it's just stupid to have to throw away working devices because a company shuts down the services that they rely on. It's just stupid.
Stupid is a nice way to put it.
It is. Well, it's also crappy. Stupid and crappy. But actually, I got more on this topic later. We'll see. We'll end the show with that. And then the other bit of hacker news is the continuing saga of the Flipper Zero panic. Now it has spread to Australia. Cars remain unaffected. So this is the continuing saga in the Flipper panic. It started off, I guess, a few weeks back with, well, I don't know, it started off months ago. But most recently, the Flipper Zero was proposed to be banned in Canada. And now in Queensland, Australia, Superintendent Robert Fleischer says that these gadgets can be used to scan and copy electronic car keys, which is probably not true, but that won't stop him from trying to gain some publicity by trying to put a ban on the thing. So we'll see what happens. I'm hoping this will die down pretty soon. As we pointed out in the aftermath of the Canadian movements, there's basically no way you could use this to copy rolling code car keys from any modern car, and we've run a bunch of articles on that. So in case you're wondering why it won't work, it's actually really interesting. You should dig in. And if you do already know why it doesn't work and you happen to be in Queensland, Australia, let them know what's up.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
Then that brings us to What's That Sound?
Ooh, here we go.
We play a sound sample, you guess what it is, and if you get it right, you get a Hackaday Podcast t-shirt. Let's go.
Here we go. One more time.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I don't know.
Wild guess, broad genre.
Video game?
I
don't know.
Pretty good. No, that's pretty good. Video game celebratory fanfare. But what video game?
Donkey Kong. I don't know.
Super.
I'm terrible at video games.
It was a question for the listeners. I knew you wouldn't get this one. This was totally unfair. I'm really sorry. So if you happen to know what it is, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. Scroll on down to What's That Sound? Find the form there. Type in your best guess and your handle. And if we pick you next week from among the correct answers, you stand a chance of winning a Hackaday Podcast t-shirt. All right, my first hack this week is the big news in security. I guess our coverage of it started off with a write-up by Jonathan Bennett, security alert, potential SSH backdoor via liblzma. And that's what it is. And a backdoor in SSH is bad news because it's used in a whole bunch of Linux systems. And actually, as far as I can figure out, nobody's 100% sure what exactly the backdoor does. It may give code execution. It may allow snooping on otherwise secure communications channels. I don't know if anyone knows what exactly it does. What's interesting, though, is how it does it and how it got there. And both of those are fantastically detailed stories. The how it does it is already complicated enough, and I'll put a link into an open wall write-up by Andres Freund about this. OpenSSH doesn't use liblzma at all, actually. What happens is that some distributions have patched OpenSSH to support systemd notifications. So this is like if you're not a Linux person, systemd is kind of this gigantic piece of software that does a million things, including system logging stuff. And so it looks like the Debian folks patched it so that OpenSSH could do logging using systemd. The problem is systemd uses this LZMA. And so what the hacker did was inject code into this LZMA library that gets called by systemd. And when it's called by systemd and notices that it was referenced in turn by SSH, it deploys its malicious payload. And actually only under a very weird set of circumstances that make it look like it's definitely trying to be not discovered. So it's kind of amazing that it got discovered at all. What's crazier still is how this malicious code got into the code base for LZMA. It's not in the code base for LZMA. It's put into the build scripts to build the LZMA binaries in GitHub. And it was actually injected in there as part of a test script to test if the compression function in the liblzma library, that is the XZ compression method, is actually working or not. And so when you do these test suites, you've got some input, and then it should run through the compressor, and then if it's correct, it should turn into this other binary. So it's kind of normal and expected to have binary files in there. This one is actually carefully constructed to unpack itself during the building of the binary blob and inject this bad code into the final compiled thing. So it's a really crazy hidden hack because, of course, liblzma and all the XZ stuff is completely open source. So there's essentially no way to sneak malicious code directly into that code base. And so what the hacker did was submit a patch saying, oh, here, I'll help you with your test code. Here's a test suite. You can use this file, convert it, test it, see if it matches that file. And that's where the malicious code lies. And this is where this story gets really deep. And that is the kind of social engineering effort that was undertaken to get Lasse Collin, who is the manager of the liblzma project, to allow someone else to help him. And then this person who was helping him, of course, is the one who injected this evil code into the code base. And this is where it turns into like deep 3-letter acronym agency type territory, because this is exactly the kind of horrible mental games and abuse that they do to try to get people to take their bad code in. So there's a great write-up of this, and we also covered it on Hackaday. Exploit the stressed out package maintainer, exploit the software package. This is a great documentation of the hacking effort on the social engineering side by Rob Menching, and you should absolutely give that a listen. What's neat about open source software development, of course, is then all of the development's done in the open too. So we can go back and look at all the communications between the package manager and the people submitting the bad code to it and see exactly what they did. And so what it looks like from looking at the communication around this is that a few people, probably 3, kind of tag teamed the poor owner of the liblzma repository to pressure him into accepting help from someone writing these test suites and then eventually inject this bad code into it. There are a few people, and I'm going to use people in quotes because I think they're all probably the same fake people, namely Jigar Kumar and Dennis Enns, who are hassling Lasse about, why there haven't been any updates to his software in a few weeks, and kind of just stressing him about the update cycle of his open source package. And then in comes our savior, Jia Tan here, who's like, oh, I totally know how to do this sort of testing stuff. I'll help you with it. And Jia is, of course, then the person who injected the malicious software into the whole thing. And it totally looks like this was a team of people, or maybe they're all aliases for the same people, or who knows what, who kind of beat down, stressed out the package maintainer in order to get their bad code put in there. And this is where it totally smells of three-letter acronym playbook. And if I were guessing, the person who submitted the evil code's name is Jia Tan, so it's Chinese. And that means that this was absolutely an NSA operation, because there's no way the Chinese would put a Chinese named person as the source here. So I guess it could be the Russians. Anyway, this is just a horrible story because there's this poor package maintainer, Lasse Collin here, who's just getting tag teamed by people who are probably government operatives to try to beat him down into accepting this bad code that then is this incredibly convoluted hack that pulls it out. This story is still developing, it's still brand new, and it's going to make an awesome novel once all the details finally come out in about a year. I mean, this is really insane. But it also goes to absolutely underline the XKCD 2347, which is that, for everything out there in our software infrastructure, it all relies on some poor stressed out dev somewhere. And if you pull this card out, the whole house of cards collapses. And that's exactly what happened here. And what's particularly disheartening about this is it really does look like it was a dedicated, probably government-backed attempt at backdooring SSH for whatever reason. Monumental. The good news, of course, is that because this is open source, this stuff got tested, it got caught before it made it out to most distributions, and it's been fixed already. So problem solved, but boy, skullduggery. I went on way too long about that. But it's just the most bonkers story I've seen in ages.
Chances are I might go on way too long about this.
All right.
My first hack is Retro Gadgets, Butler in a Box. This is a video from Popular Science. It's about a voice-controlled home automation system from the early 80s that Popular Science calls the Lost AI. The Master Voice Butler in a Box came out somewhere between 1983 and 1987, and the Popular Science gentleman managed to find one on eBay complete with its 134-page instruction manual, which is apparently a key component as it contains the access pin code, which can't be changed or bypassed, allegedly. Someone did show up in the comments and said something to the effect that it can possibly be bypassed. So it came with two appliance modules, a cassette tape, and a length of phone cord. And it basically worked through carrier current and X10 technology. You plugged your lamp into an appliance module and plugged that in, and you assigned it a physical code on the appliance module box, like A1. And then you have to spend a half an hour with the cassette tape training it to understand your voice. Now, and the thing touts that it can understand up to 4 languages, but what it really means is it can handle 4 different users. But they have to go through the whole training too, even to use the same commands. But they can't even call it the same thing. They have to choose their own name for the butler. It only came with 2 appliance modules, but it could handle up to 32. And they estimated that it would cost over $10,000 to basically use this at all back then, to get it, properly wired up, to get the microphones wired up in every room. But probably the worst part is that there are several backup batteries in case of a power outage, but they only preserve the programming for 3 hours.
Oh, no.
So all that time is wasted after 3 hours.
Oh, that's horrible.
And the inventor has quite an interesting backstory. At 16, he got his parents to sign over power of attorney, allegedly, again, so he could play the stock market. He was a professional magician, and he owned a 7-Eleven at age 21. Gus Searcy, the inventor of the Master Voice Butler in a Box.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Part of his inspiration for this was that someone asked him why he can pull a rabbit out of a hat, but he can't turn a lamp on with his voice. And the other half of his inspiration came from Demon Seed,
Okay.
in which a home is controlled by an automation system that forcefully impregnates its owner. Yikes.
Yikes.
And on that note,
I'm just watching the video. That thing is amazing for whatever, mid 80s.
yeah.
Yeah.
Very difficult to use, though.
But I mean, given that 1980s era technology is now $5 on a microcontroller, I wonder what it's doing that's interesting enough to, like, it must be listening for patterns in whatever you're saying and trying to figure that out. I'd really love to see how this thing works.
Yeah.
Oh, here's LinkedIn, a neat teardown of the physical device. I mean, that doesn't tell us all that much, except it's got an error appropriate microcontroller in it and a bunch of memory and stuff. All right, my next hack is a hacky hack from serial hacker Charles Lohr. LoRa with no radio. And this is a modern and very clever take on kind of an old trick. And that is to make radio signals with a device that's not intended to be a radio. In fact, just a microcontroller and a small length of wire. What he's doing is he's sending out square waves on this wire, and it's like accidentally radiating out. And here the project is to figure out how to send out LoRa modulated data over the radio waves using just a microcontroller. And that's actually a million times harder because LoRa is kind of a proprietary modulation method, and although it's been very well kind of reverse engineered and documented by the community, there's no real explicit official documentation out there available, at least not without an NDA. I certainly haven't ever seen any. So LoRa works by sending a frequency modulated signal out, but it sends them out in these chirps where they're either rising pitches or falling pitches, and then the length and speed of the rise and fall encode the data. It's a really neat and very robust protocol, and that is Charles's take home after this, is that, well, and I'll just totally give away the punchline. He manages to send data 2.5 kilometers away on a bog standard ESP32 with a little wire attached to it just by using code. And that's already, kudos right there. That's a super hack. But as he concludes, it's also a testament to the amazing robustness of the LoRa modulation protocol. He's broadcasting this with, microwatts, picowatts, nanowatts, who knows, tiny, tiny, tiny power. And it's radiating out of the world's worst antenna, and still he's able to pick it up. I got into flying remote control airplanes a couple summers ago, and the range you can get out of these tiny little LoRa transmitters is really, truly amazing. And, if you have line of sight, 4 kilometers, 6 kilometers is not a problem. So, it's madness. Madness. Clever, clever, clever DSP. Anyway, what's even more clever than the LoRa encoding is Charles's attempts at making it work here. And it's not easy. There's a lot of trial and error here. And what I loved about his video, and he's very open about this, is that there was so much trial and error. And he's like, I think he did 1,900 commits to the first version of this software in order to make it work. Like, there's a lot of fine tuning here. And part of what lets him do that is that at the beginning of this project, he spent some time on the tool chain. And so he's got the setup where it can recompile only the part of it it needs, flash it up to the chip, and get that all done within a second. That's awesome by itself, because if you're used to kind of a 20 or 30 second, even a 10-second time scale to get your new code compiled and sent up to the device, if you multiply that by 1,900 times, you're sitting around waiting a lot. But if you can get that code compile test cycle down so that it's really, really, really fast, you can make 1,900 iterations and it'll only take you, 15 hours instead of 15 days or something. I mean, it's really pretty impressive. He uses a bunch of other great tools here, including GQRX, which is a spectrum waterfall plotting tool that I happen to also love. Uses the AirSpy Mini, which is like one of those RTL SDR dongles on steroids. And of course, he's using GNU Radio. Last is, of course, on the software side, there's some really clever stuff going on here because he ends up implementing this on 3 different microcontrollers, none of which are capable of creating a 900 megahertz signal, which is what he needs for this LoRa transmitter. And so they're all using kind of different aliased versions of it. There's a lot of crazy hijinks on the software side here. And some of this calculation can't be done in real time, so it's all loaded up ahead of time in kind of lookup tables. So he takes each of the possible up chirps and down chirps, pre-computes what he needs the GPIO sequence to be that then will alias up to the correct signal to work. And that's like the real secret sauce trick of this. And that's something that when I get a few spare hours, I'm going to totally dig into because it's all up on his GitHub.
Well, here's a slightly less hacky hack, I suppose, but it's still cool, nonetheless. My next hack comes from Hackaday alum Jeremy Cook. Give your Pi Pico CapTouch inputs for all your music needs. You might know that the RP2040 doesn't come with a native capacitive touch peripheral, but you can still do it in software if you have a pull-up resistor. So you might remember a couple weeks ago, we had a post about Jeremy's pair of MIDI kalimbas that he made using Pi Picos and a capacitive touch board that he rolled himself.
Yeah.
Well, this is the story of that board version 2, which is fully open source but also available on Tindy. And now it has 23 touch sensing inputs. And Jeremy shows it off with a couple of cool tricks, including using some old MacroPad PCBs as capacitive touch inputs, making a MacroPad of MacroPads. And he also hooked up some spoons and made a MIDI spoon instrument. So yeah, it's a fun video.
Capacitive touch is so fun. It's still, like, I totally understand how it works, and I've seen it implemented a million times, and it still feels like magic. Because, like, there's no button there. How is it possible?
Me, I'm the button.
Yeah, exactly. MIDI spoons. Good job. Well, my last hack this week is electrospinning artificial heart valves by Riley's lab. This is really cool. Electrospinning is neat, interesting, and easier than I guess I thought it was. And this video is a good watch if you're at all interested in that. He starts out as simply as you possibly could here, which is, I think, what drew me in. He's got a high voltage power supply, he's got a syringe, and he's got a piece of aluminum foil. He takes some polycaprolactone and dissolves that in acetone. So he's got kind of a, whatever that is, a long chain. He's got like a polymer acetone slurry. He loads that up in the syringe, hooks up the positive end of the high voltage generator to the needle on the end of the syringe and the negative to the piece of aluminum foil, and slowly starts squeezing liquid out of the syringe with his thumb. And because of the voltage, you can see these little strands of fluid jumping randomly over at the aluminum. And boom, that's electrospinning. And what's really neat is if you get the viscosity of this fluid low enough, but it's still like stretchy polymery enough, it makes this ultra thin fiber when it lands on the aluminum foil. And then the question is, what can you do with this? If you do it just like this, you end up with kind of a circular sheet of something that looks like a stretchable, slightly gauzy filament, but it's really kind of strong and extremely thin. Really neat material. You know, unless you need a round shape of the stuff, you're kind of out of luck. So the next thing he does is he wraps the aluminum foil to make it into a cylinder. Essentially, like, it's kind of Pringles can size and shape. So he hooks this up to a motor. So he's got a spinning cylinder at the negative potential now. He also 3D prints a quick little machine to slowly press the syringe for him. So he doesn't have to do that by hand anymore. And he sets up this rig, and it fairly uniformly coats this spinning cylinder, which of course when it's done you can cut and it gives you a nice sheet of the stuff. And that's really cool too. But then he wants to make, quote, heart valves. He wants to make one-way valves out of this stuff. To do that, he makes a 3D printed target, paints it in conductive paint, connects that up to the negative voltage, and now he's got a rig that when this 3D printed model spins, it gets this filament deposited on it, and he gets a kind of modeled, he gets kind of a shaped sheet of the stuff and not just a flat sheet anymore. That's where this takes steps toward actually becoming a heart valve, is that by making the right 3D printed model, you get a kind of deformed sheet of exactly the right shape of this kind of super thin electro-spun, plasticky, rubbery polymer thing that can make something that looks like a heart valve. Really crazy, really neat, but also, in essence, really simple. All he needs here is some 3D printed parts, a high voltage power supply, and some plastic goop that you can order on the internet. So it's really neat. I don't know what use I have for this method, but I've seen now a new method that calls out for me to make a use for it.
Do it.
What's the nail that I need for this hammer? It just looks amazing. He actually does some slow motion video of the stuff depositing, right? And you could see it, the electrical field lines like ripping these tiny little threads of goopy polymer stuff out. Really fantastic.
My last hack comes from researchers at Augusta University experiencing visual handicaps and their impact on daily life with VR. Now, I chose this one honestly because my mom, like many people her age, has cataracts and she's understandably scared to have them removed. And I've started to think about whether I will ever have mine removed when I undoubtedly grow them. But this project really, really shows you what it's like to have various ocular impairments and diseases like cataracts or macular degeneration and or retinopathy. And some of them seem easy to simulate, like the general blurriness of cataracts, but it's a little more complicated than that, than just blurriness. And there are others like macular degeneration are more difficult, and that's where the eye tracking comes in. So the VR user can see how frustrating it is to have, say, a dark spot in your vision that moves everywhere you try to look, which you can try to imagine, but until it's in front of your face and you're trying to look at anything and it just catches right up to what you're trying to look at, it's got to be the most frustrating thing on earth. I can't imagine living with that. So it's very interesting to see, I think.
I was visiting my parents who are significantly older, and actually my aunt and uncle were there too, and they were all having their old people rant about how designers these days don't design around, X, Y, or Z. I mean, I think it was about getting into and out of showers and about reading stuff, and absolutely right. They're like, these young whippersnapper architects aren't designing, there's no grab rail in here. If I slip in this shower, I'm going to fall and bust my hip. And,
Heck, I want a grab bar. I'm 44. I want a grab bar.
I hear you. It makes it easier to get in and out of the shower without slipping.
Yeah.
I mean, what the hell? That's exactly right. And I think, yes, that's one side of accessibility, I think, actually, is that a lot of these things that are meant for people, who have various limitations, they actually help all the rest of us who don't have these limitations too. What was it? There was a brand of kitchen things, OXO, that started out that way. They have these like really chunky big handles that are just so awesome to use.
The Good Grips line.
And I think they started off with that being aimed at people who had difficulties using their hands. And then they were like, hey, these are great for everybody. But then what my aunt was ranting on about is that she thought that the hotel architect folks should have people come in there who have 80-year-old hips try to get into this shower without falling, and then they would understand it. the kind of lack of empathy from younger designer folks designing stuff for older people, or in this case, who have macular degeneration. It's hard if you don't have these issues to understand how to design for them. And so I think something like this is actually fantastically useful. And that's exactly what my aunt was talking about. This is the VR equivalent of, try getting into this shower without a grab rail. And I think that kind of empathy is hard to have unless you understand the problem. And so I think this VR application is actually a really cool one. All right, my quick hacks this week start off with a cold boot attack you can do with a Pi. This is a documentation by Anfractuosity of attempts to read the RAM off of a Raspberry Pi 4 after it had been turned off. And this is the cold boot attack. It was called the cold boot attack because usually you would take the device, unplug it, and then keep it cold because that keeps the bits longer in the RAM than at room temperature. But here it's actually a room temperature cold boot attack. And the report is about 3/4 of a second after power down. And Fractuosity could recover all of the data in the Pi 4's memory. This is just a really cool setup for playing around with the cold boot attack idea on some simple hardware that you might have. Speaking of cheap hacks, ESP Drone building an ESP32 based quadcopter for not much cash. This sports a $12 price tag, and it's a completely scratch-built quadcopter, including all of the processing and open source hardware, software by Circuit Digest. You'd have to shop quite smartly to get it in under $12, but I bet you could do it for 20 easily. A quick soldering video by Mr. Solderfix is always welcome. This is SMD soldering without the blobs. I love this guy's videos. And instead of tinning the pad first and then putting your SMD component down, which always ends up with too much solder blobbing all over the place, his simple trick is that he tins the point of the soldering iron and just uses that little amount of solder to tack the part down first, and then goes back and fixes it all up. Makes some beautiful looking connections. And last up, your annual reminder that giant capacitors aren't always better. Why is my 470 microfarad electrolytic cap more like 20 microfarads? By Tamid Mahbub. The short answer is parasitic inductance. It, at higher frequencies, can make it look like it has a lot less capacitance than you might be planning for. So if you haven't been exposed to this, now you have.
My first quick hack comes from Tomo Kihara and Daniel Koppen. Art exhibit lets you hide from self-driving cars. Now, self-driving cars have to practice being around humans, but what about the opposite? What we really need is a game like this one that challenges people not to get hit by self-driving cars. Basically, you try to cross a little street without being detected by an AI-powered camera. The reporter tried various methods, including the Dune Desert Shimmy Walk and hiding behind a stop sign, and had limited success. Next up is Durf's video killed the radio alarm clock. Do you want a cooler way to wake up than some jingle on your phone? Sure you do. Here's a video alarm clock that plays archival MTV footage at random, back when they actually played the music videos for which they're named. The build is inside an 80s portable TV and even uses the CRT for maximum nostalgia. The video files are on a Raspberry Pi. Durf is using a smart outlet to power it and a cron job to start the video player. Lastly, we have Celgen Studios' lamp becomes rotating illuminated sign for festival table. Celgen Studios wants to exhibit some things at VCF and wanted to have a spinning illuminated sign to draw attention and give information about what is being shown. So they wanted to use an ordinary table lamp, so they started with a rotisserie spinner unit, which was really loud and kinda slow, and a disco bulb, which was way too fast. And they settled on a solar-powered spinning product platform and a corncob LED to power it. It spins just right and looks really nice. And FYI, a little show tie-in here. Celgen Studios has been trying to reverse engineer one of those Butler in a box things we talked about earlier for the last 8 years.
Wow. And that takes us to the can't miss articles. These are long form pieces written by our own Hackaday writing staff. And this week, I wanted to pick Jenny lists how Star Trek breached the defenses of a major broadcaster. And this is my tie-in right here because this is the story of Jenny finding an old broadcast TV descrambler in a storage locker somewhere and reminiscing about how it came to be. Let's see, it was the brainchild of a German hacker who could, because it was satellite, receive Sky TV broadcasts, but they were scrambled. But because he was German and not in the UK, he couldn't pay for the descrambler box for it. And he really wanted to watch Star Trek The New Generation Season 7. And so he built a descrambler for it. This is the story then of her Season 7 descrambler. And it's called Season 7. I love that. What's really interesting here is, of course, you should know better than to make Trekkie fans mad by not letting them watch their TV show. I mean, what was Sky even thinking? And, you know, especially you don't want to alienate the German hackers because they're going to do it. I thought that was really, really awesome. And my tie-in then is back to that gigabit story at the very top of the show, where, you know, they discontinue a home IoT device line. Who's the early adopters in home IoT stuff? A bunch of nerds. Who's going to hack it and make it work anyway? A bunch of nerds. And I just love this kind of, I just love it when our folks do this. But I think it's really neat. This is a great story and just a marvelous first-person account of Jenny's experience with this. But then she went on to track down the guy who made the Season 7. And his name is actually Marcus Kuhn, and he's now at Cambridge University. And, you know, he's gone on to, you know, better and legitimater things, of course. But, you know, in his misspent youth, wrote a decryptor so that he could watch Star Trek in Germany that was being broadcast over it. I just think it's such a, you know, it's just one story of many, but I think it's just such a sweet little one. And you should know better than to make Star Trek fans angry.
Well, yeah.
You know, as these stories always go, there's kind of been an eternal cat and mouse between the encryption systems and the people trying to decrypt them. And that plays out here too. And Season 7 actually had an updatable card in it that you could put in with a little microcontroller in it that you could plug in, so that in case Sky changed its encryption system, you could just get a new little card and insert that in there and decrypt whatever it is they changed it to. But I think they got even smarter still and started decrypting it in a way that couldn't be decrypted eventually, at least not with the hardware provided. So, you know, also the eternal cat and mouse between the encryptors and the decryptors. That's just such a sweet little microcosm.
I wish he'd called it Season 7 of 9. Wah wah.
And of course, because this is such a recurring theme in our community, there's a bunch of great stories shared in the comments where other people are coming in with, you know, TV encryption and decryption boxes of their youth. So really, really cool.
For my can't miss, I chose Al Williams's Tech Support, Can AI Be Worse? And here, Al ponders whether AI can do a better job at tech support than the average low-paid human who typically answers the phone. And after a recent encounter with tech support, he feels that the answer is yes. Al was tasked with figuring out why, in a group chat, an iPhone has intermittent difficulty communicating if and only if there is an Android phone in the chat. So he calls the carrier's 800 line for help and gets the treatment and the answer you'd expect from them, which is that iPhones can't text Android phones. Yeah, no. So then Al goes the social media route, which is supposed to be the fast track to reaching the tech workers who actually do stuff around there. But no matter, because their questions and responses clearly indicate that they didn't read Al's detailed post at all. So it sounds like Al got nowhere. And he says that, yes, using, say, ChatGPT to filter out callers like Al would be a boon to the tech support side of many companies, but they shouldn't rely on it completely, and I would have to agree with all of that.
I've had a bunch of these. Like this is a totally common rant, like where you clearly know more about the problem than the person you're asking for help. And I'm sure that's the case here with Al, and it's just so intensely frustrating. On the other hand, I've had a couple of these support events. Man, I had one. I used to be on a networking company called speakeasy.net in the States. Holy cow, did they have smart people working their tech support line. And you would go in, you'd get the first level person who would be like, did you turn it off and on again? And, blah, 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 blah. And once you passed their like 5-point, 10-point checklist or whatever, or you said something that, convinced them that you knew something about what you were talking to, they would escalate you up to someone who with like 2000 IQ who knows everything about networking just like that.
Nifty.
And that was such a pleasant experience. And I think that's part of what Al's getting at here is that, the really super big brain tech support people are very few on the ground and probably also extremely high paid, right? So you want to use their resources as well as you can. And so if you could do kind of a first stage triaging with an AI system, maybe that would help. On the other hand, they were doing this first stage triaging system with people too, and it seemed to work just fine. Whether the AI system will end up frustrating the requesters of help more than a person who's ready to pass you on to the next level or not, I can only speculate. Man, but speaking of AI, did you read Jenny's Renter 2, A Bold New Direction for Hackaday, her
I
April
did.
Fool's article?
I'm sorry I missed my chance to use it.
Yeah, well, it was only up and running for less than a second, let's say.
Oh, okay.
Maybe no seconds, to be precise. But it's a great article, pretty funny. Jenny imagines what it would be like if instead of an AI, you had Hackaday writers suggesting solutions to your technical problems. And the answers, of course, include, throw a 555 at it and 3D model a cylinder.
Yeah.
And you want a hole drilled in something, you should 3D model a cylinder to represent the hole.
You're still using wood when there's wood-based 3D printer filaments out there?
Right? Yeah.
Plebe.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. Touche. And that's a wrap. Thank you all very much for listening. If you have any comments or want to check out the links mentioned in the show, head on over to the show notes, hackaday.com/podcast. And if you want to send us some sweet tips at hackaday.com. And until next week,
Keep on hacking.
Continuing one more time. So if you know
Yeah, I'm back. It kicked me off.
you still there? Alexa, order 10 packs of diapers.
I figure out a way to play with Lego that you can't hear it.
Thanks. No one will ever know. You'd have to sharp. Blah, blah, blah.
Here we go.
Done and done.
I said my thing.
We're done.